Okay, let's see here. Can you all see my screen? It should be Maya.
Yeah.
Awesome. Go ahead and open up your Maya if you haven't already. We're going to be playing around in it a little bit today. Similar to what we did last class, if you follow along or do something similar to what I'm doing, that's the homework for tonight as well. It'll be exercise 4 called simulation. It won't be too bad today. It'll be about like last class. We're going to look at some stuff. We're going to do some things. Get my notes so I stay on track. There we go. Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about a couple different ways to simulate stuff inside of my last class. We did more effects stuff. We did particles, we did end cloth, that sort of stuff. This time we're going to be talking about fluids. We're going to look at a couple different ways to do those. We're also going to be talking about something called Bullet, which is the physics engine inside of Maya. So before we can even start anything, we need to make sure that some plugins are turned on. For those of you at home, I'll go over this a couple of times. So if your Maya is still popping up, no worries. But we're just going to come over here to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and Plugin Manager. And there's a whole bunch of them that we're going to turn on. So those of you at home, once your Maya is all up and you've got your Plugin Manager open, just let me know. And Alex, you'll want to do this too, because they probably won't be enabled.
I got you. I'm already on that.
Yeah.
You're going to reach out.
I'm there.
Awesome. Good, good, good. Everyone else is still booting up.
Who's able to do this? You said it was due at the beginning of this class.
Yeah, last night's was. Yeah. Yep. You're good. All right, so once you have your plugin manager, remember you can just go Windows, Settings, Preference, Plugin Manager. There's a couple things we want to check. So you want to make sure this ABC bullet is checked. You can have it loaded and auto load if you want. I went ahead and clicked auto load, so I want it to turn on every time I open up my Maya. You also want to make sure ABC export and import are checked. This allows you to export different types of formats, but it also lets you work with the bullet. You also want to make sure bullet itself is turned on right here. And then you want to scroll down a little ways toward the very bottom and make sure all of your Bifrost stuff is turned on. So it's Bifrost Mesh, Bifrost Graph, Bifrost Shell Node, VisPlug, and Boss. These should automatically be on, but in case they're not, you want to make sure these are on. And just some cool ones that I'm going to point out. We're going to be using this MASH one next class. So if you want to have that one auto-loaded at home, you can. But there's also this Rococo motion library. This is like pre-animated animations you can like pull in that you can attach to your own rig. that sort of thing. You can sim on. It's cool. There's some free stuff in there, and then there's some paid stuff, but I think the most expensive thing is $6 or $12 on there, so it's really not too expensive. And then if you don't have Arnold, it's down here. And if you like to play in Substance Painter, there's the plugin for that too. Does anyone at home need me to repeat any plugins to check? We want the ABC bullet, export and import. We want the bullet. And then we want all of the Bifrost ones turned on. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some ways to simulate fluids, things like fire, smoke, explosions. So what we're going to do is let's make sure we're in the effects tab here. And I'm just going to come over here to where it says fluids. And there's a whole bunch of different things in here. So we can create oceans, ponds, but we can also create things like 3D and 2D containers. They're pretty much the exact same, except for the fact one is like a 2D card, so it's flat. So I'll click on this. So you can see it's I'm used to a different program right now. So space is the play button, but it's not now. So it's a 2D flat card. But what we want right now is 3D, which is the same thing, except it works in 3D. And you can see we get this kind of voxely, pixely smoke. And this is actually our fluid. In my experience, fluids themselves, while yes, you can use them to create water and things like that, is mostly used for things like smoke, fire, and explosions. We won't be doing any explosions in class, but they're pretty easy to do once you know all the buttons. So the first thing you really need to know about using these little fluid boxes is you never want to scrub on your timeline. Again, we're still working with simulation stuff, so we can't really scrub, otherwise it can break stuff. Your Maya may or may not crash, it might overthink itself. So just be aware if you change anything, it should reset on each playthrough. But if it doesn't, just hit stop and then start from the beginning. Another good thing to know about these fluids is if you scale them in here, all you're doing is scaling how the texture itself is being shown. So it'll stretch and shift. If you need to rescale your box, so let's say you have a dragon that's breathing fire and you want it to, be really large, starting at the dragon's face and going down. In order to change the size and location of this, you can move it however you like. I'm gonna actually just move it up a little bit so it's not under the grid. You can move this however you like, but if you need to rescale it, we do have to go into our attribute editor and change its size inside of the fluid shape. So if I wanted it to be 100 by 10 by 5, it's now 100 wide by 10 tall by 5 deep. I'm just going to make mine 30 by 30 by 30. Just make it nice and large. You can make it whatever size you like. Those of you working at home, smaller sizes will sim a little bit quicker, especially once we turn that resolution up. The higher your resolution, the slower it goes. The lower the resolution, the faster it goes. But the higher the resolution, the better your quality. The lower the resolution, the lower the quality. And it's right here. So let's take a look at that itself. So if I hit play, I'm still getting this kind of chunky, boxy quality here. It's not really fluidish. It's just kind of like a fuzzy box. I'm going to up my resolution here quite a bit, and I'm going to say 60. So the difference between 10 and 60 is, see how I get little boxes here every time I click to go back to the beginning. This is our resolution. This is 60 by 60 by 60. So you've got a whole bunch of little boxes in here. And when I hit play, it looks slightly different. It's a little bit better looking. It actually looks like it's a smoke instead of just like a fuzzy box. And then for those of you at home, if you need to make your resolution lower or higher, you can change that around. For instance, this is playing quite nicely, so I'll probably stay at 60. But if I wanted to go to like 120 and just double that, you'll see my box down here at the bottom gets super dense. I start chugging a little bit more. It's going to go real slow, but my quality will be super high. Normally, you would change this base resolution before you render, after you cache. So I'm going to change that back down to 60, so it'll actually move a little quick. So that is our container properties. Some other things to be aware of in here is there's this keep voxel square. That's your resolution. You can toggle this off. And the only difference that you'll get is you can now change your resolution here to be 60, 60, 60, which is what it currently is. I could say like make this height 110. And you'll see that it's got good quality on the sides, but not up and down. I'm going to turn that back on. We also have boundary X, Y, and Z. Pretty much what this is it says, hey, emit in a certain direction and not in another direction. Don't go past a certain location. So if I tell it X, none. It'll still hit this like glass wall, but it'll just keep going. It won't like act like it's inside of a glass box. So if I turn this back on, you'll see when it hits the top, it'll kind of dome out as though it's hit something. Like that. So if you know that you're going to be having a sim and you just need it to keep going in a direction, you don't really want it to collide with something, you can turn it off in its boundary. So the second section here is this content method. So this is what is being simmed. So we have density, velocity, temperature, fuel, color, and fall off. This is the default with density and velocity being the ones turned on, and your color method is static or use shading. You also have static and dynamic. Turning these on will change how it is shaded. So just be aware. I'm going to keep use shading color for today's lecture, but if you want to turn one of those on, you can play with it at your leisure. We also have temperature and fuel here. If you're going to be creating a fire or an explosion, having your temperature and fuel turned on will allow you to actually ignite your fluid. So you'll actually have a glow, a heat source inside there. We'll look at it a little later. I'm going to go ahead and keep these turned off just for right now, but I'll come back up here in a minute and we'll turn those on. Next here is your display. So this is how is it being viewed. So we can easily turn this off if we don't want to see it. As render, this is what it would look like on render. We also have just density, so you can only see the density. Your temperature, nothing happens because I don't have my temperature on. Same with fuel. You can see just the collision, there is none. You can see density and color, so it would show you both, and so on and so forth all the way down through in here. I like to leave mine as render, but if you notice or you're working with something else and you turn your fluid off, so if I come over here, click my fluid and hide it, it's still simming, even though it's hidden. So just be aware that you may also have to turn that to none over here as off. Now, your slices per voxel are how much is being produced per one of these little boxes. 2 is pretty standard. Upping that a little bit will get you a slightly better sim, might slow some things down, but you'll get a slightly more voxely box up here. So you can see I get a little bit more pixelated. I'll leave mine at 2. Your quality can either be faster or better. That just means how much easy is it simming? Is it going to sim a better simulation, or is it just going to be fast? I'm going to leave mine at fast. This next section is all personal preference. There's this boundary draw. So currently mine is set to bottom. That is this grid here. This allows us to see our resolution and keep track of which side is our bottom of our box. You can have this as reduced. So it's whichever side is not being viewed by the camera. You can do outline, which is the whole box. I don't know why you would use this one. It's very busy. There's also bounding box, which is just the outside. This one's pretty nice and popular. It's very slim. You can also turn it off if you're like, I don't want to see that box at all. Like, I don't get it. I don't like it. It's in my way. You can turn that off as well. And then the one that I really don't understand is full, which is every single box possible. You can't even see your thing at this point. It's just, why? It's just, you can't even see your fluid. It's just, it's there. I personally am a fan of the bottom one and none and bounding box. You can use whichever one you like best. You can also turn off or on numeric display. So this is the actual number of the particles being simmed in your fluid. So you can see I don't have many right here at the start. Based off of density, you can also do temperature, there is none, and fuel, there is none. I'm gonna leave this off. You can also turn your wireframe to be off particles or rectangles. So currently if I go to wireframe, currently mine's just little dots. Personally, I'm a fan of the rectangles because they'll get larger or smaller depending on their size. Or you can just like be like, no, I don't care about the wireframe. So you can choose whichever one you like. So if I hit play, my particles get bigger. That's why I like the little boxes, because the boxes get bigger over life. It's a little easier to see where your motion is going in your fluid. All right. The next thing in here is this velocity draw. Now this is a visual indicator of how your particle is moving inside of this fluid. This is a really important one because if you start noticing you're getting some weirdness in your fluid, you can turn this on and try to figure out where that weird kind of motion is coming from. So I'm going to turn this on, and you can see I get all of these little arrows and dots. All these dots are actually really tiny, small arrows. And how this works is it says, hey, here's where my motion's starting. You can see it's pulling up with these arrows. And they're following that motion, and they're going to start coiling around. When they hit this top, you can see they go out like so. So this is a really good way to track your motion in here and to see which direction it's heading at any given point. If I were to give this a lot longer, you'd start seeing little curls inside of the mushroom cloud that it's making. I'm just going to turn that off. So it follows that motion through your sim. Next section is the dynamic simulation. This is how is it interacting with the world, how is it looking. We have our gravity. We can increase this. Remember that 9.8 is our realistic gravity. If we increase the gravity, it'll go a little faster. We can take it in the opposite direction and have it work against gravity. Maybe it sinks, maybe it's like dry ice, or maybe it's just blowing downward instead of up. So I'm going to leave mine like this with gravity going down. We can also change the viscosity, or how viscous is it. So I'm just going to up this a little bit. And you can see it goes a little slower and has a little bit more of that tensilness that viscosity gets, a little bit more sluggish in its motion. And it speeds up once I turn it off. You can also turn your friction on if you're like, hey, I really want it to go down quickly, but once it hits the ground, I want it to kind of stick, like it's got a heavier friction to it. Maybe it's like some sort of weird kind of thick fog that clings to everything. So you can see it slows down once it hits the ground. And then your damp is, do you need it to be a little bit less of what it's doing or act in a slightly different way? The next little section here is all your math. This is all the math that is being done for you, so you don't have to calculate it. So your solver is the different math type solver. So Navier-Stokes is a math calculation that you guys don't have to worry about. There's also spring mesh, which is a bit different. You can turn off your detail solve. So currently it's set to off. I personally like having all grids turned on. So pretty much it's like, hey, give me the highest quality sim I can get. What should happen is it should work pretty well, but it's going to be a little bit slower. But it'll give us a higher quality. So you can see I've got a better definition here as compared to before. So you can see I kind of get this motion of it coming down a little bit nicer. You can also do all grids except velocity, depending on if you have a lot of velocity or movement in here, or if you just have your velocity. But this is just a different math simulation, or how many calculations of that Navier-Stokes is it doing. Your substeps, these are just the same as in when we talked about end-cloth and end particles. The higher your substeps, the more it's calculating the same sim per frame. I'm leaving mine at 1 for here, but just know if you up that substeps, it will increase your render time, but it'll also increase your quality. You can also turn up your solver quality manually. So I can be like, I want it at 100% quality. Give me the best sim. It's still pretty fast, at least on this computer. And you'll see I have a little bit better quality. It's a little bit fuzzier. It's a little bit cleaner, that sort of thing. And then do you want it to be, how do you want it to be interpolated based off the grid? Linear works pretty well. You can also change when your start frame is and what the rate of your simulation is. This is really fun. When you start playing with simulation rate, if you turn on this forward advocation on, pretty much it says, hey, I know I want my sim to go a little faster at the beginning. I want it to kind of boom. I can be like, hey, I want my simulation rate to be 5 with this forward advocation. If I turn this on, it's like, whoa, let's go fast for the first 5 parts of the calculation. And then we can slow down to a constant rate of 5. So having forward advocation on versus not is just what it sounds like. It's just, hey, do it a lot faster at the beginning. So it's still going at a rate of 5 without it on, but that first advocation pushes it a little bit further. It's more like a times than an add. And then if you're going to check with substeps, just make sure your computer's nice and beefy because it'll start emitting your sim with those substeps on. I'm not going to do that. So next is the liquids. If you want to turn this into a liquid sim, you can check this and it'll change just how it interacts. So you can see it falls a little faster, acts more like water being poured, that sort of thing. Auto resize is really important. If you're going to be having a massive explosion type sim, or maybe you've got a building that's on fire, something like that, you want to make sure your auto resize is on so it's not wasting any space. So if I turn this on, pretty much what's going to happen is my box is pretty much going to shrink down to nothing when I hit play, and it's going to follow my sim, and it's not ever going to hit a bottom. It's just going to stop emitting at a certain point. Having this turned on will also help your computer run a little faster, but will also give you a bit of a better sim to play with, especially if you want something like flamethrower, which if we turned this on its side, give it some color, would probably be a flamethrower. If we wanted this to be a waterfall, we don't really want it to hit the bottom. We would want it to keep going till it hits a different colliding object. So just be aware, this auto resize is a thing. I'm going to leave mine on for now. You can turn on self-attraction and repulsion. Pretty much it's like, hey, do you want it to force itself away based off of its density? We're not really going to see too much here. I'm going to hit self-repel go up pretty far. So you see it kind of pushes away from the center a little faster. I'm going to turn this off. Next is our content details. This is everything about how it looks and appears and is moving. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. Our grid cache, this is what is being cached. Leaving all of these on works pretty well. If you know you're never going to have temperature or fuel or color, you can turn all those off to save some space. The surface, this is how is it being rendered from what's around it. So currently it's being read as a volume. You can change that to a surface render, which will give you a more of a fluid-like look. If I change that to soft surface and hard surface, it'll change how it appears. Just be aware that if you want to do something a little bit more water-like, a little bit more like it's got surface mass, just turning that to surface render will change that. Output mesh, we can change things about how it is being created as a mesh, which we'll do in a bit. Your shading and quality and textures and lighting we'll look at last. So let's go back up to this content details here. So pretty much what these are how is this right here simulating, moving and shifting in space. So your density, this is how dense is it, how is it diffusing or dissipating away at any given point. Really quick, I'm just going to change my gravity back to the standard 9.8 Earth gravity. So we can take a look at this here. So right here, this is pretty dense. It's about half, it's 0.5. If I pause this and restart it and take this down even further, you'll see I'm still pretty dense, but I'm not as dense. If I take it up, it gets quite an amount denser. So depending on if you need a less intensive flame or smoke or a more intensive flame, smoke, or explosion, you can change this density in its scale. We also have our buoyancy. This is how quickly does it rise. Currently it's set to 1. If I take it down into the negatives, it will go down. So if you don't want to change your gravity, you can change its buoyancy. You can also change it at will. You can keyframe this to get slightly different results. The higher the buoyancy, the faster it will rise. The lower the buoyancy, the faster it'll fall. Pretty easy stuff. I'm gonna put that back at maybe 1.25 for funsies. Have it rise a little quick. Now, the one that's really interesting and fun to play with is dissipation and diffusion. The higher your dissipation, the more it will dissipate. So the faster it will dissipate into the air. Think like if you've ever seen like a campfire smoke, it rises and then it slowly fades off into the sky. Or if you've ever watched someone that smokes, if they've got their cigarette and they're waving it around, the smoke kind of tendrils and then disappears. That's dissipation. Diffusion, on the other hand, is how is it diffusing through the air. So if I up that quite a bit, it's diffusing in the space. This is a good way to get things like candle flames, different types of flame types you can get with this diffusion. So you see it just kind of builds here. So we can combine these and be like, hey, I want a high diffusion and a super high dissipation. And now we have like a little candle flame. Turn that diffusion off. Next we have pressure. This is how much pressure is behind your sim. Changing your pressure, its threshold, and its noise will change just how quickly it pushes through the air, as well as its tension and force and gradient force. Velocity makes it really nice and cool and fun. It adds a bit of swirl, a bit of naturalness to your motion, a bit of that billowing that you get with fire and smoke. If you add a bit of noise, it'll add a bit of random to it. Your turbulence here is how strong is the wind affecting it. The higher the strength, the faster it'll billow. You can also change the frequency of which the noise that's pushing it is being shown, as well as its speed. Do you want it to be faster or pretty slow? So I'm just going to leave mine something like this. A little bit of swirl, a little bit of strength to its frequency, like this. If you do have temperature and fuel turned on, this is where all of those buttons will be located. So if I scroll up here, I'm going to turn on this to dynamic grid, scroll down here, and I can say, hey, I want my temperature scale to be decently high, maybe 1.5. Maybe I want the temperature to be a little bit more buoyant, so it's defaulted at 3. Maybe I want my reaction speed to be pretty quick. So you see it goes up a little faster. How much heat do I need released? Do I want any light to be released? I'm going to say yes. What color do you want that light? Probably like fiery color, like an orange. So I pause this. In theory, it is now fire. It is releasing heat and light and temperature. If I were to come back up here to the top and turn these back off, it's thinking. I'm going to do some calculations. You can see these are now turned off. I can't change them. It's still thinking. And then same with the color. If we need to have the color shift around, if we have that color turned on, we'll be able to play here. So we talked about grid cache. We talked about surface. We're going to talk about output mesh a little later. But then we have this shading. This is how it appears on render. So everything on here is slightly different depending on how you want your flame, explosion, smoke, whatever, to look. So your transparency. So if you like your density, but it just feels a little too thick visually, you can come in here and turn your transparency up or down. So you can be like, I want it to be a little bit thicker, a little thinner. You can have a little bit more of a glow to it. So if you want your Arnold to glow a little bit more, nothing's there. How do you want your edge to drop off? Do you need that to fade a little bit more, coming in a little too pixely? You can turn that off or on. Your color is what is the color of your sim. Same way as how we did particles. We can be like, hey, I really want this to be like a pink. I want that to be a constant color. Maybe I want a secondary color to be like blue, pale blue. And I want this to be like a gradient. So you can see certain parts are a little brighter depending on where they are on your gradient. You can also be like, I want the dense parts to be pink. I want it to start from the center of this and go out. Depending on how you have your sim set up, the color will change based on what your input is. I'm going to do a Y gradient. I want it to start blue and then pink. So this works kind of the opposite of how particles worked. So with particles, this was the last color that you'll see. It's the opposite. This will be the last color that you see. Your incandescence is how is it glowing? What's the colors? So if I click this one, I can change this to be pink. And I can change this one to be blue. And if I render it, it's probably not going to do anything because I have it set to temperature. But if I set this to a constant, You'll see it's glowing from that last color, like the particles did, because it's a constant color. If I do my gradient, you can see it's glowing more of this pink. I can easily take this one down. We'll re-render only half of it. Should get something a little different. Now I have more of that blue. And then you can come in here, and depending on how your opacity looks in this curve that you can create, will also depend on how opaque it gets the longer it lives. So if I re-render that again, it should fade off a little bit toward the end. So it's a little bit brighter now because I'm a little further down. Your shading quality is how much quality do you want it to have? Do you want it to be better, less, that sort of thing? Textures, do you need it to have a texture, color, a noise, anything along those lines? And then do you want it to light itself? I highly recommend lighting yourself. That way you get a little bit more interesting shadows and detail in there. And then everything else in here is just how is it being displayed? How is it rendering? Is it being seen by Arnold? That sort of thing. Does anyone have questions about Fluid so far? No? So other things, just real quick, that we can do in here is I'm going to turn my gravity so it's in the -9 direction. I'm just going to sim that a little bit, see how it looks. I'm not too worried about my color or anything. Just going down, looks kind of neat. So what we can do with our fluid is the same thing we did with our particles, is we can actually mesh this. So there is that surface down here where we can be like, hey, I want this to be a surface render. I want it to look more like water, act a little bit more like water. We can do that same thing, except without using the surface render, is we can convert it, just like we did with our particle, to a mesh somewhere in here. Fluid to polygon. So I'm just going to click that, and it's going to automatically bring me down here to output mesh right here. And if I hit play, you'll see I get this kind of watery, pixely mesh. I'm just going to minimize some of these things here. So how this works and its output mesh settings is a little similar to the polygon one. So our mesh method currently is triangle. We can switch that to quads for something a little bit more voxely. We can do tetrahedra, which allows us to get a little bit more fluid-like detail. And then we can do acute tetrahedra, which just adds even more. Mine may or may not have crashed. Your mesh resolution, nope, it didn't. But you can see I got a lot more detail in here. I'm going to go back to triangle, though, just so I don't break something. Your mesh resolution, the lower that goes, the less detail you get. The higher this goes, the more detail you get. Just be aware that the higher this is a math solution to however much smoothing you have. So if I up my smoothing, and then I up this, it's going to add a lot more tessellation and detail to our sim. And then should you want to scrub on your timeline at this point, you can always come up here to fluids. You can create an in-cache Maya fluid right here. I'm not going to do that. It takes quite a bit of time. But if you want to be able to scrub and make sure your sim looks perfectly good, you can turn on this cache. Yes?
What if you convert it to a polygon?
So you can come over here to modify, convert, and down toward the bottom is fluid to polygon. And then all you have to do is go into your fluid and it's this output mesh and that's all your detail. So let's go ahead. I'm going to delete these. And let's take a look at bullet. So bullet is the physics engine destruction method inside of Maya. And we're not going to look too far into it, but we are going to play around with it just a little bit. So in here, you'll see that there should now be a bullet. If you've got that bullet plugin turned on, there's a bullet section here. There's things like active rigid bodies, passive rigid bodies, ragdolls, soft dolls, body anchors, all of these really cool, interesting words. We're not going to look at all of them, but we'll look at a few. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn my grid back on so I can see where my ground plane would be. And I'm just going to make a box. And I'm going to duplicate that box. And I'm going to duplicate that box. I'm going to duplicate it, and duplicate it, and duplicate it. I'm going to grab all of those. I'm going to duplicate those. I'm going to duplicate those. And again, and again. And then I'm going to grab all of those. And I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to duplicate that. You don't have to follow along with this part if you don't want to. And duplicate this. You can only do one or two if you want. I'm going to do quite a few duplications. And then I'm just going to take all this. I'm going to move it just straight up in the air. So how bullet works is it says, hey, I want to apply gravity and physics to objects to make them fall, interact, and act like objects in 3D space. So I'm going to select all of these, and I'm going to come up here to bullet and make them active rigid bodies. What should happen is it's going to think, it's going to do some math here, and you'll see I have this line that builds all the way across. This is your pass line. This is really important. If you're not at 1, it will assume that whatever frame you're on is the new frame 1. So if you're on frame 99 and you start this, it's going to think 99 is frame 1. So you always want to make sure you go back in time before you change anything at all with bullet. So I'm going to hit play, and they fall, kind of like the end cloth did. And if I scrub down over here in my outliner, you'll see I got this bullet solver. This is the solver. This allows your stuff to fall and interact and act with gravity. So I'm going to come over here. And in my bullet solver, I'm going to click one of these little dudes. There's this bullet rigid shape that gets created for each of your little meshes. Inside there is your body type. So this is dynamic. You can also do kinematic, which is keyframeable, and static, which means it's not going to do anything. You can change the mass of each of these. Never sleeps means it never stops. I'm going to leave mine at just like this. You can change your friction with the restitution or how it acts, as well as its initial components, forces, its collider properties. They're boxes, so box works great. And then just different things about its collision. So I'm going to come over here to bullet solver again. And I'm not seeing my shape one, which is odd. They have changed this and I do not like it. Bear with me for just a moment, guys. Aha, it's here now. So I'm going to turn my ground plane on under solver properties. When I hit play, they collide with the ground and collapse, which is pretty neat. What we can also do is create objects that are in the way. So I'm going to take this, make this a bit bigger, and I'm going to make an object that's going to interact with them. So I'm going to click on this one, and in my bullet, I'm going to make it a passive rigid body. This one's not going to move. This is going to act like a collider. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll see, again, make sure you're at frame 1, that my sphere here has a box collision. So the green lines are your collision, or the white lines are your collision. And since this is a sphere, obviously it's not going to be a box. We can come down to its collider properties and change that type to sphere. Now, if you're doing a complex mesh, sphere or box, capsule or hull, plane, cylinder, all of those may or may not work. Hull is pretty much just an empty collider. It fills the entire shape. And if you're using a specific mesh, you can input that mesh as its colliding property. But sphere is going to work quite well because this is a sphere. And if we go back to the top, we can see our body type is now static because it's not moving. It's not going to interact or shift. Things are interacting with it. So if I hit play, then I'll collide, roll, bounce off, and do different things because that is there. So that's neat, right? You see how like you'd have maybe a whole stack of boxes, and maybe you've got a character and they come up and they smack it and they fly into the air. That'd be pretty neat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all of this. Just going to delete that. And I'm going to create a couple of cylinders. You can do different shapes if you like. And all I'm going to do is I'm gonna go to top view here real quick. And I'm just gonna move them around and make a very not like noticeable shape here that has no connotation to physics whatsoever. Like so. You can do 1, you can do 2, you can do none. I'm actually going to hide all but this front one for right now. Boop. And I'm just going to lift him up. And I'm going to make a sphere. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to go bowling virtually, since, COVID. So we're going to virtually bowl here with this ball I just made and these spheres. So how this works is I can say, hey, I want this sphere here to act as a passive rigid body because it's going to be acting on with force. But I still want it to be passive. It's not going to be changing. It's not going to be doing anything odd. So even though I've made it a passive body, I'm going to change its body type to dynamic. I'm also going to change its mass. I'm going to make it maybe like a 3. The more your mass is, oh, hold on, I've done messed up. I started at frame 67. That's a problem. Change this, do that, do that. The higher its mass, the faster it will go. It's the same way as like if you drop 2 bowling balls, one lighter, one heavier, the heavier one will go a little faster when you roll it. So I'm just going to leave that at 3. And then I'm going to come down here and change my collider type to sphere. Something very important to remember when you're doing things inside of Bullet is you have to manually change each individual collider type. So if I, for instance, have all 10 of these cylinders, I will have to manually change all 10 of those cylinders to a different collider type when I get to that point. So if you're going to make like 1,000,000 of a shape and have it drop like 100, I don't know, like butterflies or something, you're going to want to make sure you do them one at a time. Or you can do all of them and change all of their collider shapes all at once. But if you highlight all of them, it'll only change the one that you clicked first. So what I want to do now is I want to come down here to its velocity. And in its Z space, so X, Y, and Z, I'm going to change it to, I don't know which direction it's going to go. I'm going to say maybe -20. And it's going to roll. So I'm going to come down to my bullet solver. I'm going to turn my ground plane on, just like we did a minute ago. Do that again. And it's going to go directly through where our pin is. So I'm going to go ahead and take this pin, and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to make this an active rigid body because it's going to be actively interacting with another shape. And you can see I'm going to have to change my collider type. It's definitely not a sphere. It's not a capsule. Hull works pretty well for things that are basic shapes. They haven't really been changed too much. So if I hit play, boop, it interacts. Now we can also say, hey, I want this cylinder to not be knocked over so easily. We can change its mass. So I'm going to say like 50. So now it just interacts with it a little bit. So we can use this to be like, yeah, I want this to still knock over, but maybe just not as easily. Maybe you've got a giant, sphere and a large column that you need to knock over in the Parthenon or something like that. This would be a good way to do that. So now I'm going to turn all my other cylinders back on, lift those up. I'm going to also make those active rigid bodies. And I'm going to go through and just click one at a time, change each of these to hull. Like so. And when I hit play, because this one has others around it, their mass is also interacting with this front one. So if I take this one back down to 1, it bowls through a little easier. I can then go back to my sphere and say, maybe I really want my sphere to be heavy. Maybe make that 50. And get a different reaction. Any question over bullet? Anyone online got any questions, anything like that? Awesome. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play around with the Bifrost graph editor. We're not really going to go too far into it. It's still relatively new. I just want to show you it exists. It's kind of neat. So I'm going to actually come over to the Bifrost tab. And there's these two graphs right here. One's the graph editor and one's the browser. In the browser, this is all different things you can create with Bifrost. It's kind of like a template section in here that you can just kind of look at, and it does some really neat stuff. It'll kind of walk you through how to use Bifrost to do certain things in here. And then the graph here is just like a programming version, node-based effect stuff. It's just cool. So we can create a graph and be like, hey, I want my input to go into something and go out of something. Since it's all node-based, we can like click, we can create new things. We can show displays, all sorts of stuff. We can tab out of here. Come on. To go into things. It's just neat. And then we have our actual Bifrost fluid, which depending on how strong your computer is, since we do have people at home, we're not gonna actually play with it like we normally would. Pretty much, you can create large scale fluid sims, flood buildings, create oceans, all sorts of neat stuff. But I just wanted to let you guys know this is here. So if I were to click this one, this is the graph on how to make the effect that we just imported, where it makes different color smokes. Instead of using fluid, it uses this graph here. So we have like, how is it evaluating different curves? Is it scaling? This is very, very similar to blueprints in Unreal. But I just wanted to let you guys know it's there, it exists. It's really cool. XGen is the hair simulator. You can create and paint hair, design how it works in here. On D2L in the notes section, I do have my notes for this class that I was using to kind of keep myself on track and kind of lead you guys through some different things. There is a full section on there on hair and how to use XGen based off, like, I think it was 2019's version of XGen, so it might be a little different. But you can also include that as an exercise. So if you're like, oh, that sounds interesting, you can follow along with that and create some hair as well for your homework. But other than that, that's all for today's class. It's a pretty quick lecture. I wanted to give you guys some time to kind of play around with the different things we've talked about. And then the homework is just to either take an animation, like an image, you can create a play blast, you can render out a sequence if you like, of something similar to what we did today. So if you followed along, you can do something that you've already done. If you didn't follow along but want to do something that's different, you can do that. But other than that, does anyone have any questions about that at all? Anything we talked about?
Is the homework due next class or Friday?
Next class.
All right.
Yeah, not Friday. Today's Wednesday, so it'd be due Monday. And then we'll be starting your next project on Monday as well. But if you guys don't have questions, you're more than welcome to pop out. If you've got any questions or comments or anything, feel free to stay. Yeah, go take a nap if you need to. Alex, you dead? I think he's dead. He's laid back. Alex, you awake? You dead? I think he's breathing.